time was coming for Jesus. He knew it was coming. He knew that he didn't have much time left before he was taken away to be killed. He walked along the dirt path that went into the city of Jerusalem once more, just like he had been doing for the past several days. He had been spending his nights on a hill called the Mount of Olives, and then he would wake up early, head down to the temple in Jerusalem, and he would teach the people there. Huge crowds were gathered each day to hear him preach, and so the temple became his for a while. When he first came into the city, the people adored him and shouted his name, begging him to save them and calling him the new king of Israel. He was teaching in the same city that King David ruled 1,000 years before that. Jesus was actually a distant relative of King David on his mother's side, and so he felt right at home in that place. But more than that, the temple in Jerusalem was the house that the Israelites had built and rebuilt for God. It was a place of praise and worship to their God, a place where they could sacrifice animals like goats, sheep, and doves to God, to show him how much they loved him and how sorry they were for all the times they had broken his law. When Jesus first came into the temple, it did not look like it should have. Something was wrong. There were bankers and traders everywhere. They had turned the temple into something like a mall or a bank. No one was praying or worshiping like they were supposed to do in the temple. So Jesus had taken some ropes, and he made a whip out of them. He ran at the traders and cheats, and he began to threaten them. He flipped over the tables, bashed the cages that held their for-sale animals, and he screamed out, "In the Bible it says that the temple is God's house, and that his house is for prayer, but you have turned it into a place for thieves and robbers." Once the temple was empty of all the evil people, he began teaching there. And while he taught, many of the Jewish leaders, who were the normal teachers, asked him questions. Now see, they didn't like his answers, and they didn't like how he was teaching in the place they were supposed to teach. The people who used to listen to them were now listening to him, and soon enough they couldn't stand Jesus. He had upset them so many times and had exposed how they were only teaching for themselves and not really for God. They wanted people to respect them. They didn't care about the coming of the kingdom of God. And soon enough, they just wanted Jesus gone, even if they had to kill him. But there was one problem. The people loved Jesus so much that they knew that they couldn't do anything in public. They couldn't just stone him or arrest him because the people would go crazy. So today was a day just like any other. Or at least it seemed to be. He was walking into the main part of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, and his disciples met him just outside the city walls. They probably expected another day of teaching, just as Jesus had been doing the last few weeks. However, today was not the same as every other. It was the Passover. It was the end of Jesus' ministry. It was the last day before he would be crucified. And he knew, but they didn't. They would find out soon enough. You see, Judas, one of the Lord's disciples, had been slowly stealing from Jesus. He was taking out of their money bag. The money in that bag was meant for the poor, but Judas was taking some, little by little. He was greedy. He loved money. And Jesus had taught that loving money was the cause for all evil. But Judas didn't listen, and Satan got a hold of his heart. Judas went to the Jewish teachers who wanted to kill Jesus and told them that if they paid him, then he would tell them when to come and arrest Jesus. They had to come when no one else was around, and then they could arrest Jesus. They set up a plan that during the Passover meal, Judas would sneak out when no one was watching and would go to them in secret. Then Judas would bring them back to arrest Jesus when he wasn't teaching. That way none of the people could become upset. They thought it was the perfect plan. Now, like I said, today was the Passover, and the time had come for Jesus to be surprised with his arrest. Or so Judas thought. When Jesus met his disciples at the walls, they asked him what he was planning to do for the Passover meal. And he told them that he wanted to eat it with them. But Jesus was not a rich man. He didn't even have a house. So the disciples asked him where they ought to have their celebration. Jesus told them to go into the city, and a man would meet them carrying a jar of water. Jesus instructed them to follow him into his house, because that man would let them have a room in his second floor where they could celebrate. So the disciples went to the man's house and said, "The teacher asks you, where is the guest room? Where may I eat the Passover with my disciples?" The man showed him a room, and they began preparing the food for the dinner. When the evening came, Jesus entered the home, and they were all there. He began by washing their feet. Now this was strange for Jesus to do, because usually it was only the slaves or the servants of the household who would clean the guests' feet. But Jesus wrapped a towel around his waist, and he told the disciples to come to him. He washed their feet one by one, and eventually it was Peter's turn. But Peter hated the idea that his master would clean his dirty feet. So he said, "Master, you aren't going to clean my feet, are you?" Jesus replied, "You don't understand now, but you will get it later." "No," Peter said, "I will never let you, my master, wash my feet." But Jesus looked at him in the eyes and said, "Peter, if you do not let me wash you, then you are not with me." Then Peter doubled down. "Not only my feet, Lord, then, but my whole body. Wash all of me." But Jesus would not. And he said, "Only your feet need washing. You've been washed already. I just need to clean your feet. You all are now entirely clean, except for one of you." The disciples didn't know what he meant by one of them being unclean, but Jesus was referring to Judas in secret. See, Jesus wasn't going to be surprised. Jesus knew everything. Then it was time to enjoy the meal. Jesus sat down with them to eat. He began the meal by saying, "I have long waited for this day when I can eat with you before I suffer." The disciples frowned. "Before he suffers?" they thought. "What does he mean?" But Jesus continued, "I won't eat bread or drink wine again until the kingdom of God comes and you all are with me." Jesus picked up a piece of bread and he lifted it up to pray over it. He said, This bread is my body, broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He broke the bread and he passed it around to the disciples, and they each took some to eat. Once they had eaten some bread, he raised the cup of wine toward heaven, and he prayed over it, saying, "This wine is the blood of the new covenant between man and God. Take some of this wine, for this wine is my blood, which will be poured out for you." The disciples all drank from the wine and finished their bread. And then Jesus told them that at the table there with them was the one who had betrayed him. He said, "Tonight is the night that I will be taken away, and while this is my destiny and it must happen, cursed is the one who brought this upon me. Cursed be the one who betrayed me." Then all began to wonder and ask each other who they thought was the traitor. And John, who was right next to Jesus, said, "Lord, who betrayed you?" Jesus responded, Watch whom I give this bread to." He dipped a piece of bread in a dish of oil, and then he handed it to Judas. Judas looked up fearfully. "Are you saying I did it, Master?" Jesus told him, "Go ahead, do what you must do." Judas got up from the table and left the house. Once he had left, Jesus told the disciples about what was about to happen to him. He warned them that many of them would run away and act like they didn't know Jesus that night. He especially warned Peter to not lose faith after he had denied his master. Peter said, "Lord, I will die with you tonight if I have to." But Jesus knew what would really happen, and he told Peter that he would deny being a disciple of Jesus 3 times, 3 different times, before the rooster even crowed tomorrow morning. Jesus prayed for his disciples. He taught them a few more things. He prayed that they would be given a long life, that they would love each other so deeply that everyone knew that they were sent by God. Jesus prayed that they would be like one body, just as Jesus was one with his heavenly Father, and that they would continue to have faith in Jesus and would live in Jesus as long as they were on the earth. He thanked God for giving the gospel to such disciples as them, men who were young, dumb, and humble, instead of to the teachers of Israel, because he knew that if the teachers of Israel would have received the same gospel, they would have corrupted it and made it dirty in their pride. When Jesus had finished praying, he and his disciples sang a hymn, and then they went out into the Garden of Gethsemane, which was at the base of the Mount of Olives. Jesus told them to keep watch and to pray. Then he went a bit further into the garden, and he felt the fear bubbling up in his heart. He knew that what lied ahead was not going to be fun, and that he would be tortured and killed in the coming hours. So he prayed, "Father, I don't want to have to drink this bitter cup of suffering. Please don't let this happen to me." But then he prayed, "However, Father, do not do what I want, but only do what you want." He then felt the Spirit of the Lord come upon him, and he knew what he had to do. He was dripping in sweat, but he knew what he had to do. He got up and went to rejoin his disciples, but he saw them all asleep. "Get up," he said. "You need to be praying that God will keep you from being tested tonight." As soon as he had said this, a crowd entered into the garden. The crowd was led by Judas, and it was a group of Jewish leaders and teachers, along with some guards. The crowd surrounded Jesus and his disciples, and then Judas walked up to Jesus, stared him in the face, and kissed his cheek. Judas wanted to seem friendly, but really, he was just showing the crowd which one of them was the one that needed to be taken away. His kiss was the signal. As they began to approach Jesus, Peter got nervous and asked if they ought to fight back. Without being told yes or no, he rushed at the guards, and he cut off one of the guards' ears. Jesus told him to back down, and then picked the ear up and placed it back on the guard's face, and it was healed. Then Jesus asked the leaders and teachers, "Do you all think that I'm some sort of thief or criminal? You come to me with swords like I'm going to fight back. But go ahead, do as you must. This is your hour, the hour of darkness." They grabbed Jesus and led him in front of the high priest of Israel. The high priest's name was Caiaphas, and he was the top dog. He would make the decision of whether or not the leaders and teachers had the right to have Jesus killed for his crimes. As Jesus stood in front of Caiaphas, Peter was just outside the high priest's house. He had been following the crowd to find out where they were taking Jesus. But he knew he would get in trouble if he walked into the house, so he stayed outside, listening in on what they were saying. Eventually, Peter got cold. It was nighttime at this point, and the temperature was dropping. So he went over to where some of the people from the crowd had now lit a fire. He sat down with them, and a little servant girl pointed at him and said, "Wait a minute. Aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?" Peter responded, "Lady, you're crazy. I don't know him." Then another of him said, "I remember seeing you with him." And he denied it again, saying, "I most certainly was not." Then another, about an hour later, said, "Man, I could have sworn I saw you with Jesus." But Peter got annoyed, and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about, sir." And as soon as he said "sir," he heard a rooster crow in the distance. Jesus' word had come true about Peter denying him 3 times that night before the rooster crowed. Peter left in tears. Meanwhile, Jesus was at the high priest Caiaphas' house, being mocked and beaten by the ones who led him there. They even put a blindfold over his eyes and then hit him. Each time they would hit him, they would say, "If you're so powerful and know everything, tell us who hit you." The next day, the priests and elders of Israel gathered in the home of Caiaphas to hear Jesus' case. They asked Jesus if he truly thought of himself as the Messiah, and Jesus said, "Even if I tell you the truth, you won't believe it. But just know this, the Son of Man will be seated next to the Father in heaven and will have his power." Jesus already had been given all the power in heaven and on earth, but he wasn't using it because he still had to die for the sins of the world. They asked him, "Are you saying that you're God's son, since you say you will be sitting next to him and you will have his power?" Jesus said, "You have spoken correctly." And it was at that moment that they decided that they did need to kill him. The Jews then went to the Romans, who were ruling over them, and specifically to the Roman governor over the Jews, whose name was Pilate. The Jewish leader told Pilate that Jesus had refused to pay taxes to the emperor, which was not true, and that Jesus was calling himself the new king of the Jews. They were hoping that Pilate would get angry that Jesus was calling himself the king of the same people that Pilate was ruling. But Pilate wasn't feeling too upset. He just asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus responded, "Just as you have said." Pilate was not concerned, so he asked the Jewish leaders why they were so upset. They told him that Jesus had been teaching and stirring up riots all over the country, which was not true. But Pilate was still not concerned, and when he learned that Jesus was from Galilee, he realized he couldn't do anything because Galilee was ruled by another man named Herod. So he sent Jesus to Herod, who happened to be in Jerusalem for a little bit. When Herod heard that he was being brought Jesus the Messiah, he was excited because he had heard stories about this preacher and all the miracles he was doing. He was hoping that he would get to see Jesus do something miraculous. But whenever he would ask a question of Jesus, Jesus would remain silent. He wouldn't answer. He would just stand there quietly. Soon Herod began insulting Jesus, and so did his soldiers. They went and got a robe for him to wear so that they could mock him some more. Then they sent him back to Pilate. Pilate and Herod hated each other before that day, but because of all the shenanigans with Jesus, they actually became friends. When Jesus came back to Pilate, dressed like a fake king, the Jews again demanded for him to be killed. They had been taking Jesus from one ruler to another, and they were not going to leave until they got what they wanted. Pilate said to them, "You keep bringing me this man, and yet I don't think he's guilty or anything. Neither does Herod. This man has committed no crime that is deserving of death. I'll just have him whipped, and I'll send it back to you all, and that ought to teach him, and then you can all just leave me alone." But the Jews wouldn't leave without Jesus dying. So they screamed, "Crucify Jesus! Crucify him!" Pilate went away and thought about it some more. Then he came back wanting to let Jesus go free. He had Jesus whipped by the guards, and they twisted a crown of thorns and placed it on his head. Then Jesus was brought back to Pilate. Pilate told them that he would release one prisoner to them and suggested that it might be Jesus. But the shouts began again, and they wouldn't stop. The Jews were not leaving without getting what they came for. They asked him to release a different prisoner named Barabbas and to crucify Jesus. Pilate went away again, and he came back a third time asking them what crime Jesus had actually committed that deserved death. But the Jewish crowd of leaders shouted out louder and louder, so Pilate finally gave in, and he granted their request. Then he took a bowl of water, and he rinsed off his hands in it in front of them, which was his way of showing them that he was not guilty of anything, because it was them who wanted Jesus to die and not him. Jesus' blood is on your hands, he said. Barabbas was released, and the Roman soldiers took Jesus away to be crucified. Once the soldiers had finished whipping Jesus' back, and he had become weak enough not to run away, they put a cross on his back, and the same back which had just been whipped too. And they made him carry the cross to the place they would put him up on it. Along the way, Jesus became so exhausted that he fell and could not stand up under the weight of the heavy cross. So the Roman soldiers told a man who was walking in the other direction, named Simon of Cyrene, to carry Jesus' cross for him until they got to a place called Golgotha, which means the skull. Once they got to Golgotha, they laid Jesus out on the cross. They put a nail to each hand and hammered them through his hands and into the wood of the cross. This was so that he wouldn't be able to come down off the cross. Then ropes were bound around his hands to further secure them. The same was done for his feet, and he was hoisted up, along with 2 other criminals who had been crucified with him. One thief was on the right of Jesus, and one was on the left. He looked out over the people, at his disciples, at Mary Magdalene, at his own mother, who was watching him die. He especially watched the ones who had just crucified him, the Roman soldiers, the Jewish people, and he looked out on them with love. Then he said, "My Father, forgive them, for they don't understand what they've done." Over Jesus' head they posted a note that read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." The crowds mocked him as he hung up there, and even the 2 thieves began to insult them. They said things like, "If you're the Son of God, just come down off the cross. And you trust in God, so let God deliver you, since you are his son." One of the thieves said to him, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save us and yourself from off these crosses." But the other thief changed his heart and said, "Are you mocking this man and disrespecting God even while in your last few hours alive? Do you not fear God?" Then he turned to Jesus and begged him, "Lord, won't you please remember me when you come into your kingdom?" Jesus replied, "Don't worry, you will be with me today in paradise." And then the skies went dark. It was only around noon, but the sun disappeared for 3 hours. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." They sent up some bitter vinegar water, using a sponge and a long pole. But Jesus didn't drink any of it. And then he cried out, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was quoting King David from the Psalms. Jesus then said, "Father, into your hands I give up my spirit." The people watched what might happen, thinking he might have been calling down Elijah from heaven, and at last he cried, "It is finished." Jesus' last breath came out of his mouth, and he bowed his head and died. Meanwhile, inside the temple, the veil which guarded the room where God's presence was ripped from bottom to top. This was God's heart breaking for the sinfulness of humanity, and now the Spirit of God would no longer be locked up in a holy room, but would dwell inside the hearts of the followers of Jesus, his Son. Earthquakes roared throughout the countryside, and the tombs began to open with the dead having been raised. The Roman guard who watched over Jesus said at that moment, truly Jesus was the Son of God.